Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Grace Person. I'm with CivicWell. I am happy to be co-hosting today's webinar with Chris from Maven's Notebook. Maven's Notebook and the Groundwater Exchange. I'm going to pass it over to her to kick us off. Just real quick about CivicWell. We are a 40-year-old organization who have been helping we are a nonprofit supporting sustainable solutions and leaders in communities that implement them. We inspire, equip, connect, and cultivate civic leadership for local innovation and community change. We are so happy to be here and to be part of this webinar, to be bringing this webinar to you today. So Chris, take it away.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Austin. I'm otherwise known as Maven, and I publish the California Water News website, Maven's Notebook. For those who aren't familiar, Maven's Notebook is a website devoted to California water news. The website is updated 6 days a week with the latest water news from around the web, including newspaper articles, editorials, commentaries, blogs, press releases, legal analysis, reports, and scientific research, as well as breaking news whenever it occurs. I invite you to check it out at mavensnotebook.com. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for a free daily email service to get the latest news delivered to your inbox every morning. And there's a weekly version as well for those who might want a little less emails or a recap of the week's news. I also publish the Groundwater Exchange, which is a website that collects and organizes resources for SGMA implementation from DWR, the State Water Board, NGOs, and others. There are pages on projects and actions such as groundwater recharge, as well as pages on avoiding undesirable results, a video gallery, an intro to SGMA in both English and Spanish, and a SGMA implementation newsletter. You can find it at groundwaterexchange.org. My third website, the California Water Library, houses freely accessible documents and reports from agencies and others, some of which are only archived at the California Water Library. Visit the library at cawaterlibrary.net. Our popular office hour series is returning on September 27th with the PPIC's Ellen Hannock. So don't miss your chance to pick Ellen's brain on San Joaquin Valley water issues. Registration will open soon, so be sure to join our webinar list to be informed of future office hours and other events from Maven's Notebook and partners. There's a link in the chat to do so. So today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted at Maven's Notebook and the Groundwater Exchange. A follow-up email with a link to the recording and webinar resources will be sent to all registrants in the next day or two. The email will include a link to sign up to be notified of upcoming webinars, including the office hours sessions. So before we get started this morning, we'd like to know a little bit more about you. So I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat and what region you're from. And I also have a short poll. So if you could select which of these best describes you, and we'll give you a minute to answer that. Well, it looks like we have a nice selection of folks here, a nice round. Okay, I'll give just a few more seconds for people to answer. Okay, great. Here y'all are. Okay, thank you for joining. Thank you for participating in that poll. Next slide. So just a quick bit of housekeeping. Links to resources mentioned by our resources will be posted in the chat. And if you have a question, please enter it in the Q&A box. You'll be able to upvote questions that you're most interested in, and we will answer the questions from the Q&A after today's presentation. You can, if you're joining us by phone, you can email questions to me at maven@mavensnotebook.com. Next slide. Okay, our speakers today are Melissa Rohde with Rohde Environmental Consulting, Katrin Chappell with the Nature Conservancy, J. Pablo Ortiz with the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Ngodu Atume with Clean Water Action. The demonstration of the visual tool will be given by Jeff McGee, Interactive Web Designer. Today's presentation will begin with an overview of the study, a demonstration of the interactive tool to explore the data, and policy recommendations. If you have a question for our speakers, please put them in the Q&A. And now I'll hand it over to our first panelist, Melissa Rohde from Rohde Environmental Consulting, to start the presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa Rohde, principal of Rohde Environmental Consulting, LLC. But formerly, I was at the Nature Conservancy, where I, on behalf of the Groundwater Leadership Forum, led the review process for the 2020 and the 2022 groundwater sustainability plans required under California Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA. As you may know, SGMA provides California with an opportunity to sustainably manage groundwater so that this critical resource is available for a diverse set of users, such as irrigators, households, and the environment. In the past couple of years, the state has received its first round of groundwater sustainability plans required under SGMA. And so in an effort to better understand what SGMA is adding up to at the state level, the Groundwater Leadership Forum collaborated with academic researchers at University of California, Santa Barbara and Stanford University to evaluate the groundwater sustainability plans. More specifically, we evaluated how various groundwater users are integrated into groundwater sustainability plans and assessed whether or not the plans were protective of various users when establishing sustainable management criteria in the basin. Our study was recently published in Nature Communications as an open access paper and is accessible with the QR code on the screen. Our study is based on 3 key research questions. The first being, are stakeholders equally integrated into the plans? Second, does each plan's management criteria balance and protect the needs of water access for all? And third, does integration of stakeholders into the groundwater sustainability plans result in better protection? To do this, we reviewed and evaluated the 108 groundwater sustainability plans that were submitted, and to systematically assess the degree to which each sustainability plan integrated agriculture, domestic, and environmental groups and vulnerable subgroups of small farms and disadvantaged communities. We developed a scoring rubric based on stakeholder integration research. More specifically, we defined 4 generalizable integration components for which we asked, how well did each sustainability plan engage, describe, analyze impacts, and act to support stakeholders through the management initiatives? Each of these scoring components basically mimic core groundwater sustainability plan elements. For example, engage measured how well stakeholders were integrated into the GSP development process, such as having a seat on a groundwater sustainability agency board or advisory committee. Describe measured whether a stakeholder group was mapped or described in the basin setting section of the plan area sections of the GSP. Analyze evaluated whether impacts to stakeholders were analyzed and described in the sustainable management criteria section. And lastly, act evaluated if stakeholders benefited from, or if there was a description of how stakeholders would benefit from project and management actions. Our rubric then enabled us to calculate scores for each integration component ranging from 0 to 2. And then we summed them to create an aggregate integration score that ranged from 0 to 8 to assess how well each sustainability plan incorporated a particular stakeholder group throughout the groundwater sustainability plan. And then to evaluate whether or not the plans were protective of various users when establishing sustainable management criteria in the basin's groundwater sustainability plan, We conducted a geospatial assessment using the plan's minimum thresholds established at representative monitoring wells to monitor groundwater depletion or groundwater levels more specifically. And our spatial assessment first evaluated if individual agricultural or domestic wells and groundwater dependent ecosystems were within a 1.5 mile buffer distance from a representative monitoring well. This identified which wells or ecosystems that were reasonably represented by a representative monitoring well. For those wells or ecosystems that were covered by a representative monitoring well, we then compared the minimum threshold with the total well depth or the corresponding plant's maximum rooting depth to determine if the minimum thresholds were protective of individual wells or ecosystems. If the minimum threshold was shallower than the user's well or roots, then we deemed that user protected. Whereas if minimum thresholds were deeper than the total well depth or roots, then they were unprotected because they could dry up without a minimum threshold exceedance occurring. So to answer our first research question, are stakeholders equally integrated into groundwater sustainability plans? And I'm going to share those results now. What we found is that 91% of groundwater sustainability plans fail to comprehensively integrate any stakeholder in their plan. Based on theoretical scholarship on stakeholder integration, we expected that the engage, describe, analyze, and act components would build on each other. For example, if a stakeholder were engaged in the GSP development process, we were expecting that then those users would then be well identified and considered in the plans, but we did not see that. For example, while domestic and environmental scores were significantly higher than the other user groups for the describe and analyze scores, respectively, these scores did not translate into higher levels for ACT, for support for in the project and management actions section. Whereas for agricultural stakeholders, they could score consistently the same or lower for each of these components, but they achieved the same level of support through the plan actions, the ACT component, as the environment did. So although no single stakeholder group is more integrated into the plan language than another, our results indicate that the two economically disadvantaged subgroups, small farms and disadvantaged communities, were less integrated than their associated groups. And we think that that is a contributing factor is that SGMA is based on local control. And the concern here is that when state directives are low and local discretion is high, there's a potentially greater risk that sustainability plans may be co-opted by economically powerful local interests at the expense of these more vulnerable users. For our second research question, does each plan's management criteria balance and protect the needs of water access for all? What we found is that a significant percentage of agricultural wells, domestic wells, and ecosystems are currently not being protected by SGMA based on the minimum thresholds established in the plans. We found that only 40% of agricultural wells, 37% of domestic wells, and 9% of ecosystems are protected under current sustainability metrics, the minimum thresholds. And these are basically the best case estimates, since SGMA allows for a locally determined number of minimum threshold exceedances to occur without triggering an undesirable result in the basin, which in this case would be the chronic lowering of groundwater levels sustainability indicator. Using a Pearson's chi-square test, we found that there was no statistically significant difference in coverage between agricultural and domestic wells, but we found that domestic wells were significantly less protected than agricultural wells. And for the environment, coverage and protection for ecosystems were significantly lower than for the domestic and the agricultural wells. Within the domestic stakeholders, we also compared coverage and protection for wells within disadvantaged communities and outside of them. And we found no significant difference in well coverage between the two groups, but we did find that wells within disadvantaged communities were significantly less protected than domestic wells outside of disadvantaged communities. So these numbers are, again, on basically best case scenarios, since minimum threshold exceedances can be allowed if undesirable results have not been triggered in the basin. In our assessment, we found that only 24% of plans established minimum thresholds specifically to be protective of either agricultural, domestic, and or groundwater dependent ecosystem needs. So a lot of the groundwater sustainability plans have failed to sufficiently conduct impact analyses necessary to prevent adverse impacts to these beneficial groundwater users when developing their sustainable management criteria. And the resulting lack of protection shows here in our analysis. And just to put these numbers into context, the wells and ecosystems that we analyzed in our study don't even include the wells and ecosystems that exist in basins or in areas not subject to SGMA regulation in California. This essentially translates into SGMA protecting only 24% of the state's wells, 1% of the state's groundwater dependent ecosystems. So this is very disconcerting given the importance of sustainably managing groundwater so that we can support food security, the human right to water, ecosystem preservation, and resiliency to extreme climate events such as drought. This also means that vulnerable groups that use shallow groundwater and don't have the economic means to drill deeper wells, and in the case of the environment, to adapt to deeper groundwater wells, will be disproportionately burdened by groundwater depletion. In short, burdens on stakeholders that rely on shallow groundwater, like households and ecosystems, intensify the urgency of ensuring that these user groups are integrated into the decision-making process so that their water needs are considered and addressed in planning and implementation under SGMA. And for our last research question, does stakeholder integration into groundwater sustainability plans result in better protection for users? For this research question, we wanted to test whether plans that integrated stakeholders better, if they resulted in better protection for those users. And what we found is that higher aggregate integration score. So remember, these are the 4 integration components summed together: engage, describe, analyze, and act. When we sum those components, we want to know it did not result in higher coverage or protection or translate to higher coverage and protection for agricultural wells, but it did result in higher coverage and protection for domestic wells in the environment. And these results are surprising in a sense that we were able to even detect a strong relationship amidst other local variables. However, the results are also somewhat unsurprising since agricultural users largely have institutional representation through governing groundwater sustainability agencies so that their water needs are being met. Whereas domestic environmental stakeholders in disadvantaged communities and small farms don't always have the same privilege. Stakeholder groups that often lack institutional representation, such as these domestic and environmental groups, also frequently lack financial resources, time, and technical capacity to engage meaningfully in the planning process. So our findings suggest that formal opportunities for domestic and environmental groups to penetrate the decision-making process are limited despite the broad regulatory requirement to consider these beneficial users into sustainability plans. Without formal representation or more specific requirements by the Department of Water Resources, there is a need for more oversight and resources to ensure that groundwater sustainability agencies are fully integrating diverse stakeholders into their groundwater sustainability plan development and implementation process. In summary, we find that integrating diverse stakeholder voices and needs into sustainability plans and planning and management can offer better and more equitable outcomes amongst stakeholders, especially for those stakeholders who are most vulnerable to the impacts of groundwater depletion. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jeff, and he is going to present a web-based tool that visualizes the findings from our study, and so that you can drill down and filter the results from the statewide level all the way down to individual wells or ecosystems. Jeff?
Thanks so much, Melissa. So yeah, I'm going to take over the screen share for a minute, and I will take you over to sigmareview.org, which I also invite any of you to load up in your own computer. Now, Melissa's presentation might have left you with some questions about what it looked like on the ground. And I'm hoping that the specifics of the detailed information that you can get from this page will help you explore the data in greater detail. Also, this site, sigmareview.org, provides links to both the policy paper from the Groundwater Leadership Forum and the research paper from Nature. So basically, the anatomy of this page is it's a single page website. It has these series of questions that we try to explore. And then for people who aren't previously familiar with the research, a brief précis of the main points and takeaways from the research. And so these sort of bullet items here are a preview of what you're going to be getting when you interact with the deeper data here. And you'll also see on the top of the page, you'll see in the navigation in the header, jump links that will let you leap directly to the topic that you're most interested in. And so our first section addresses the question of whether the groundwater sustainability plans examined protect wells. And so there's a brief introduction, repeating some of the information in the, excuse me, I think, introduction to the question of well protection. So what the app lets you do right here is presents a statewide map of California with the Sigma basins studied highlighted. And it's visualizing about 100,000 wells in all of the 108 Sigma basins we studied in the center of the page. And then on the left is a summary view that shows you the statewide totals for all of the wells. So that you can see that this diagram on the left is basically showing the distribution of all the wells, how they break down into whether they're protected by being within the minimum, within deeper than a depth representing the minimum threshold established in the groundwater sustainability plan, or whether they're not within that threshold, or whether they're outside of the 1.5 mile radius of a monitoring well, and as such are not covered because they can't be monitored. On the right side of the screen, there's a description of the symbology in the map. The first thing you see is something that's not visible at this level of detail, but that's a sort of glowing black dot that is a monitoring well that is surrounded by a dotted line that indicates the 1.5 mile radius around the monitoring well. And then if a well is inside that area and it is deep enough to be deeper than the minimum threshold, then it's classified as protected and green. And if it's not deeper than the minimum threshold, then it's not protected if the minimum threshold happens to be deeper than the well. And then if it's outside of the monitoring area, it's considered not covered. There's also these tooltips. You can hover over these and it'll give you more information. If the legend gets in your way, you can shrink it down and bring it back like this. So this is the statewide summary. It's also got a plot of all of these GSPs, the 108 of them, along the bottom here. What this is showing you is how they stack up on a scale of 0% to 100% as far as the percentage of wells in a given GSP, how many of them are protected. You can also hover over any of these GSPs within the map, and it'll give you a detail that's also a small version of the same graphic on the left, showing the proportion of wells protected to not protected. As well as the last thing you see before the click to zoom in prompt, it says status. That has to do with the DWR determination of the plan, where it stands. A lot of them are still review in progress. And in fact, you can toggle a mode where you can see the current status of the GSP according to DWR. So the blue ones are still in progress. The green ones are approved. And another thing you can do with this legend here is you can click on this to filter down to just approved basins, unfilter, review in progress, inadequate, etc. Below the map, and I'll turn off the GSP status mode. Below the map is a tabular display that shows you the same information as what you see in the map. And when you interact with this table, it will highlight the respective GSP. You can sort them by clicking the header, so you can see which ones have the highest percentage of well protection. This is one bit of an outlier in a sense that it only has one well to protect. And you can also sort by not protected or not covered, or simply by the number of wells. So Eastern San Joaquin being our biggest one here. We can click on this in the table, or I can go over to the map and click on it, and it will take us to a closer view. It'll give us some supplementary info. On the left here, there's a link to the plan page. So if you want to go deep on it, you can do that. And it gives you the top line view. In this case, 10% of the wells are protected. And you can see how it stacks up relative to the other GSPs. So here's Eastern San Joaquin. You can hover over, when you're zoomed in this detail mode, you can also zoom in on any one of the wells, and it will give you a little more information, such as the ID number. If you're looking for a specific well and you know its ID number, you can find it in here. One thing I should emphasize is that these wells, there's something funny going on with the symbology here. I'm going to just reload. I might have been monkeying around with something that changed the symbology there. And that might be a potential bug that I'll have to look at. But okay, so here are the monitoring wells, and you can see the radius around them. The dotted line being the 1.5 mile perimeter. That is to say, 1.5 mile radius, the perimeter of the radius. And you'll see that not exactly, but more or less, the green dots, the protected wells, happen to appear inside of the 1.5 mile radius, and those outside the 1.5 mile radius are mauve, you might say, or sort of a pink. And then the red ones are also mostly inside the radius. They're marked as unprotected. What's going on here? Why are there wells that are extending beyond the radius of the monitoring well area? The reason for that, I have to say, is because this well data is slightly obfuscated for legal reasons, regulatory reasons. We're not allowed to disclose the exact location of the wells, so they've been anonymized to the center of the section, the land section that they lie in, section range aliquot, the old-timey measurement system for land parcels. And so what we've done is we've jittered them. We've added some randomness to move them apart from each other, because otherwise they would be stacked on top of each other in a sort of a 1 mile repeating grid, if that makes any sense. So what looks a little bit like spray paint overspray is just a factor of the randomization of the position, but they are within 1 mile of where they are. So when you zoom in, you can see pretty close to where they are. Another thing you can do here is you can filter by, right now we're looking at all the wells, but we could drill down to just agricultural wells. And now we're down to the number of wells has declined in that miniature chart there on the lower left. And so overall, 10% of the wells, or almost 11. Now we're up to 16% of ag wells are protected. And if we filter down to domestic wells, we're going to see just about 10%. You can also see some interesting things in that the sort of location of the wells, you can see sort of urban agglomerations of residential wells there, as opposed to the agricultural areas. That makes sense. So that is pretty much our view of the wells. One other thing I want to draw your attention to is there's a colorblind mode. If you have red-green color blindness and you find it difficult to differentiate between the red and green dots, we changed the color wheel a little bit so that it's not the most hugely contrasting thing, but I'm hoping, my understanding is that this should be easier to see if you have difficulty differentiating, and that extends also to the tabular view here. So this is a map that is repeated 3 times for the 3 questions that we address here. Do they protect ecosystems? Do they integrate stakeholders? And so we can move on down to, okay, and here's a recapitulation of the figure seen in the research paper describing what it means to be covered but not protected, covered and protected, or not covered at all. So groundwater dependent ecosystems. This is a very fine-grained, these are very small geographic areas within at the state level. So it can be a little hard to see them at the statewide level, but here what we're seeing is using that same red, green, and pink color coding, we can see groundwater dependent ecosystems statewide and inside Sigma basins, and see on the left again the distribution of how many of those acres are protected, how many are not protected, and how much are not covered by monitoring wells. And you can see again the distribution of different GSPs and where they sit on the scale from 0 to 100. This is called a B-swarm plot. So the vertical position means nothing. It's just a way of packing them in so that they're as close to the numeric value they have, but it shows you the overall shape of the data. And here it's highlighting statewide. You can actually click on these little dots and go straight to the GSP. And again, same symbology on the right, except it's line data now. So we could, for example, go to an ecosystem in, well, we could look back at Eastern San Joaquin. And here we'll see the polygons representing the groundwater dependent ecosystems identified in this area. And you can hover over them to get some more details, such as the vegetation type. So this is Fremont cottonwood here that has a typical rooting depth of about 3.5 feet. This is not covered because of the lack of monitoring wells close to it. But we can look over here and we see, okay, so this is a monitoring well that has for this area, the minimum threshold established in the plan is about 90 feet. And this ecosystem is predominantly Valley Oak, which has a rooting depth of 80 feet, which is close, but not quite there. And that's why it's determined to not be protected. Again, the same tabular display. You can expand it a little bit. You can also sort it. We have the percentage of GDE acreage that is not covered, protected, or not protected. You can also sort them. And one thing that is, I think, more useful in the ecosystems mode, maybe than in the wells mode, you can turn on a mode that will display a satellite aerial map version of this. So it's a little bit noisy with the symbols stacked on top of the map, but if you wanted to get a better sense of the underlying geography than you get from, what I admit is a fairly abstract map, you can bring it more into recognizable symbology. And if I click this close box here on San Joaquin, it'll take me back to the statewide view. And we can now move on to, what is really central to the research, the stakeholder integration. And so the way that we show the stakeholder integration is on a color ramp from blue to, which shows the highest scoring for the various integration on a score of 0 to 24. That is integrating agriculture, integrating environment, integrating domestic and disadvantaged communities. So here, again, like with the status indicator, you can click these to filter down to one of the 3 bins that we have. This is, these are GSPs that have scored 16 or more points on a scale of 0 to 24. This is sort of the middle of the pack. And then these are GSPs that were determined to have relatively low integration. You can also see the distribution of these on the left here. This is the overall score. This is for integrating agricultural. You'll see this is a 24-point score, whereas the other ones are 8 points because these are added to each other. So agricultural, domestic, and environmental. And I think one thing you can see from this is that environmental has overall higher scores, and it's a pretty wide distribution for agricultural and domestic. As with the previous, you can sort the scores. You can look at the individual integration scores or the aggregate. If you filter down to one of these, the table will filter down to just show the GSPs concerned, and then you can click on them again here. And now we're looking back at Eastern San Joaquin, which is in the middle of the pack for most of these measures, and has been approved by DWR. One last thing that I'll say is that if you're interested in looking at one specific GSP, you don't have to find it again every time you scroll up to the other map. You can just toggle between looking at integration, looking at ecosystems. Again, we're in the same GSP, or looking at wells. And I think that about covers it. And I imagine you might have questions, and I'm happy to hang out and answer them. So thank you for your time.
I'm
And,
going to share my screen next
Yeah.
for the final segment of the presentation. Oh, 1 second. Okay. should be able to see my screen now.
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. Is in present mode?
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Godo Atsume. I am a senior policy analyst at Clean Water Action. And in this final segment of the webinar, we'll discuss some recommendations from our policy report that will be put in chat now. And basically what we did was we put together some recommendations to accompany the technical research and analysis we just had. So these recommendations are focused on drinking water, environmental and climate change needs. But before I get into the recommendations, I want to provide an overview of key findings based on the entire analysis and the whole study that we did. So one of our major findings in our research was that majority of GSEs lack sufficient representation from disadvantaged communities, environmental interests, and tribes within their basins. We also found that vulnerable groundwater users were rarely considered when agencies were identifying or selecting their sustainable management criteria. Thirdly, our data shows that when stakeholders are integrated in the planning process, that is, they have a seat on the table, they're identified, they're engaged, and their feedback is incorporated, then they are more likely to be protected within those plans. We also found that many Californians could lose access to drinking water under current definitions of sustainability in most of the plans, especially with the lack of drinking water mitigation programs. Also, our studies show that California's struggling natural environment is unprotected by current plans. 9 out of 10 ecosystems in SGMA regulated basins are not protected by minimum thresholds. Another major finding was that there are significant data gaps in the representative monitoring networks, just like we saw Jeff and Melissa show in most of these plans. And what that translates to is that, for instance, in a basin, several drinking water wells could go partially or completely dry, but that would not be captured because it's not within a close proximity to the representative monitoring. Another finding was that demand management was minimized in most of these plans. And lastly, that most groundwater plans do not adequately address climate change. And we'll hear more about this from my colleague Pablo shortly. So based on these findings, we came up with a policy recommendation, and we divided the recommendations into 3 categories: funding, guidance, and closing information gaps. And we believe that with these recommendations, we'll be able to address some of the gaps that were found in this analysis and study. So the first is leveraging state funding to increase stakeholder integration. Here, our recommendation is that the requirements for GSAs applying to the states for SGMA implementation funds should be improved to ensure that vulnerable needs are addressed in plans. And this can include a requirement for metrics to show how stakeholders will be integrated before funds are rolled out. It can also be ensuring that a portion of the funds goes towards protecting ecosystems and drinking water within these basins. Another funding recommendation is to empower stakeholders to engage and participate in SGMA by providing funding to them to be able to participate. There are also some funding that should go to improving monitoring network across most of the basins. I know we only gave an example of Eastern Wakim, but across most of the basins, monitoring networks are missing and they are lacking. So it's a huge gap. Part of this is ensuring that representative monitoring network is in close proximity to vulnerable communities and users. And then expanding funding for projects that focus on reducing pumping through land use change programs. So our second sort of segment of recommendations is regarding guidance. What we've seen after many years of working on GSPs and on SGMA is that where there's guidance from the states and clear directives, local agencies tend to follow that. So one of our recommendations is that stakeholder communication documents and also tribal government engagement documents should be updated to show engagement in the GSP implementation phase, which we're going to be in for the next many years to come to 2040 and 2042. Another recommendation, is that The annual reports that GSA submits April 1 of every year should include reports on dry wells within their basins, as well as reports on efforts they are putting in place for ongoing stakeholder engagement for these vulnerable users, and also reports on water quality data. Another recommendation is to improve guidance on sustainable management criteria and how GSAs can really analyze when their minimum thresholds are impacting vulnerable groundwater users or not protecting those users. And lastly, improvements to well completion reports and expanding that to be able to help GSAs improve their monitoring networks. And now I'm going to provide some recommendations on closing information gaps and protecting drinking water users. So we've heard a lot about stakeholder engagement in SGMA. So the first recommendation here is to conduct robust and inclusive stakeholder engagement. And as we've seen in this study, that is lacking across most of the plans. In some plans, stakeholders were engaged in one segment and that did not translate to the other segments. On the ground, we've seen and heard on many cases where stakeholders have actively participated, but their feedback is not being considered, or their feedback is not part of the projects and management actions that are being selected. Another recommendation we have is to utilize the State Water Resources Control Board's groundwater monitoring tool to identify groundwater contaminants within a basin and how to monitor for them. And also, importantly, considering and analyzing the potential impacts that come from implementation of projects and management actions. And I would give an example. So we're in a wet year and a lot of GSAs are considering recharge, but it's important to analyze and account for what impacts that management action like recharge would have on vulnerable users within a basin. And also key, as we've seen from the study, is updating representative monitoring network to capture impacts of vulnerable users within a basin. Then you can say you're protecting them and you're on the path to sustainability. And lastly is the inclusion of drinking water impact mitigation plan or program. So regarding drinking water mitigation, when we did our review, 6 groundwater plans included specific language on drinking water mitigation. Few basins had very vague language on mitigation, and most basins had no language. Currently, we have not seen any basin that has adopted, funded, and is mitigating impacts to drinking water users within their boundaries. And for this, we strongly recommend DWR's recent guidance document titled Considerations for Identifying and Addressing Drinking Water Well Impacts within your basin. And I'm going to pass it over to Catherine to share some recommendations on the environmental side.
Thank you, Godo, and thanks everybody. As Godo laid out, we had a suite of recommendations building on the results of this study. And the ones that Godo walked through related to funding and guidance for from state agencies apply for all vulnerable users, but I'm going to walk through some specific recommendations on closing information gaps related to the environment. If you were to spend a little bit more time with our results and on the online tool, you would see that for environmental groundwater users who are groundwater dependent ecosystems, we saw a lot of information was incorporated into the GSPs on where they were and what they were. But one of the main problems was taking that information and integrating those GDEs into actual plan updates, management actions, and decision-making. So as with all vulnerable users, we think it's really important that GSAs conduct robust and inclusive stakeholder engagement for the environment as well. So that builds, I think, on the main recommendations of this report. And then for some specific things related to the environment and what the state could do and what GSAs can do specifically related to ecosystems is really about gathering information and closing information gaps on how groundwater use really impacts nature. We've come a long way since SGMA was passed and kind of making the connection between ecosystems and groundwater use, but we still have a ways to go, especially in one particular area I'm going to highlight. So one thing that we think is really important is that the state increases its own capacity within DWR, within the State Water Board, within the Department of Fish and Wildlife to help GSAs develop monitoring networks and protection measures and to design effective projects that improve conditions for nature. It's kind of a learning path that we're all on together, and we think it's important that the state builds up its own capacity there in order to provide guidance to the GSAs. We also think that one of the biggest areas of need and something that is was highlighted in SGMA and is going to be really important in the next layer of planning is how to identify surface water, so rivers and streams that are connected to groundwater pumping, and to identify how pumping affects those surface water systems. So when we were identifying GDEs in this report, we did not identify directly stream flow impacts. We were focusing on kind of riparian areas and GDEs along these rivers and streams, but the actual impact to the rivers themselves still need to be analyzed and quantified. And that's something that the state needs to work closely with GSAs on, because it's a really big information gap. There's like really big modeling needs and technical needs there, and that's not been included up until this point. And then another big thing, just kind of overlapping policy between SGMA and other state policies to protect nature, is that back to our last point, in order for us to understand how much water needs to stay in rivers and streams and not get pumped out through groundwater pumping, is we need to enact and therefore enforce in-stream flow requirements in priority rivers and streams across the state, so that GSAs and local water users know kind of what the rules and regulations are related to how their pumping can impact stream flow. So those are some pretty technical recommendations that we have for improving the way nature is incorporated into SGMA moving forward. But I just want to reiterate that having nature be a seat at the table really doesn't not just mean that GSAs need to engage environmental stakeholders. It means that they need to be including nature in their decision making. And I think that that's something that is important for all vulnerable groups. So I'm going to pass it next to Pablo, who's going to talk about climate change.
Thank you, Catherine. And water management is only becoming more complex as our climate keeps changing, and the importance of integrating climate change in SGMA has been widely recognized, and at least at some level in most of the groundwater sustainability plans. However, there is an oversight topic for which we have been advocating for over 4 years, and it's the integration of extreme climate change events into the water budgets and overall the water planning of the groundwater sustainability plans. And every year we have more and more examples of extreme drought and extreme drought conditions that have led to further overdraft and further damage. And just between 2021 and 2022, there were over $3 billion lost due to extreme drought only in the agricultural industry. So we moved from extreme drought to extreme precipitation events that flooded some towns in Planada, Allensworth, Pájaro. And in some way, these events caught us by surprise, or caught by surprise some of the local water agencies that then were later rushing to get some of the groundwater recharge permits. So a lot of this information and a lot of these extreme climate change events were not completely new or out of nowhere. There were already a lot of research and information related to saying that these events were going to happen. It was just a matter of when. And then there is that lack of planning and lack of kind of like more effort to consider these extreme events into the planning, often because it seems as too hard, too uncertain, or there is just not the necessary resources and funding. So climate change guidance is focused mostly on moderate changes to the climate, but more extreme scenarios will be more decisive in whether or not groundwater can be sustainably managed in the future. So to avoid underestimating water demands and overestimating water supplies, our recommendations here is that the climate change guidance for groundwater planning must require the integration of extreme change scenarios. And next slide, please. And then, of course, this will require resources. So we also recommending that the Department of Water Resources help GSAs, but mainly low capacity GSAs to secure some of the federal funding, for example, from the Inflation Reduction Act or the bipartisan infrastructure law to improve climate resilience, and of course, including for safe drinking water. And as part of the issue is also the accessibility of the data. So the state should also complete their update for extreme climate change scenarios, including data from the most recent drought and the most recent precipitation events, and then help local agencies access and navigate this climate change data that is relevant for the region. And at the local level, local agencies needs to start also dedicating some more resources and time on training people to understand this data. So thank you very much for coming to our webinar, and we are ready to take some questions.
All right, thank you, everybody. Got a lot of questions in the Q&A, so let's get started. I'm gonna go for ones that have been voted the most. And we'll start with, what are the barriers to integrating stakeholders, especially from disadvantaged communities? Who would like to jump in? Now, not everybody all at once. Okay, I'll just pick then, and Godu, what do you think?
I can go for it. So barriers integrating DACs in Sigma, I think this is an ongoing conversation that we've had, where we've actually had some people ask us, how do we do engagement, right? And I would say that's why we have the DWR guidance documents on stakeholder engagement. And we highly recommend that document. We also had a document, my organization, that we put out, Collaborating for Success, on how to engage communities, because it's quite, it's a difficult topic. There are communities that have different cultural, just different way of living, that you just don't go into their community educating them about Sigma. But I would say that this whole research is about stakeholder engagement because it's lacking. We've found that people are actually not doing it. They're not putting in the effort to do stakeholder engagement. There are a lot of meetings that are happening only in English language, right? So that's a barrier for me as a community resident to participate in that meeting. There are also a lot of meetings that were happening that are very technical. Sigma is technical, and there are no resources provided to communities to engage. And bear in mind, communities are at the forefront of this, given that their drinking water, they experience dry wells, they experience well contamination. So I think there are a lot of ways to address that. There are partnerships with community organizations that work on the ground to be able to address that. There are other programs that conduct outreach and engagement that you could partner with. There are places where you could meet community members and educate them and have conversations about Sigma. But I would say basically having, providing an opportunity and room for them to be able to participate. And importantly, we've heard repeatedly that people take their time, participate in meetings, and their feedback is not incorporated at the end of the day, right? They have plans where they've complained, you're not monitoring here, and nothing happens. That's very discouraging to residents. So I would say this few points.
No,
Yeah,
that was very good.
Can I just build on Godu's point? Because I think we were pretty intentional in talking in this report that it's not just about stakeholder engagement. It's not just about sending meeting invites and making sure people know things about happening. It's actually about integrating the needs of those vulnerable news users into the plans themselves and into the management actions and into the things that the GSAs plan to do. And so it's like goes beyond just engagement, and that I think up until this point, I do want to recognize that a lot of work has been done to try to bring people into the fold. And what needs to happen next is once they're in their fold, to Godu's point, actually taking their feedback and having it influence decision-making. And then also the GSAs themselves thinking about these vulnerable users without having to have a representative community member there. It just is integrated into their own kind of planning and decision-making. Because that's, to Godu's point, they're not, in every situation, there's not going to be a community member who can maybe attend the meeting or raise their voice. And so it has to be part of the culture and ethos of actual sustainability planning for groundwater statewide.
Great, thank you. Anybody else? Okay, moving on then. what is a model or ideal GSP that you have come across that can be used for reference purposes and for comparative analysis? And if comparative analysis has been performed, do you have a matrix with the underlying data and their values? So who would like to take that one?
I can start. I think across the board, what we saw is that no basin did a great job with all stakeholders. There were definitely examples, model examples of where a basin would do better with ground-dependent ecosystems, or if they did better with domestic wells or disadvantaged communities. But we didn't see that model behavior kind of permeate to the other users. And in addition, what we didn't see is that, you know, in these model examples, it wasn't even, there's still like quite a bit of shortcomings in terms of the analysis of the impacts that's necessary in the sustainable management criteria. When folks did a pretty good, decent job with integrating a particular user, they basically went as far as engaging them and identifying them in the basin setting section of the plan. And in very few cases did we see actual analysis to make sure that particular users would be protected by the sustainable management criteria. And I don't know if the rest of the team has anything else to add on to that.
Just to say that that is a similar case, not only for engagement, but for example, the integration of climate change. Some integrated in one way, some integrated in another. And I don't have the names from the top of my head on like the particular GSPs, no, but the ones that integrate best the extreme climate change scenarios are those that kind of like went above and ahead of the recommendation from DWR and integrate something else beyond that to include these other extreme scenarios that were not entirely required by DWR, but only suggested.
Great, thank you. Anybody else have anything to add? Okay, moving on. With 85% of the wells in East San Joaquin unmonitored, are there local efforts to address monitoring wells? Can existing production wells be used as monitoring wells with the permission of the owner? If not, why? And what is the GSP agency responsibility for increasing monitoring?
I can start. I can't speak on behalf of East Joaquin, but basically in the plans, so in every basin, there's a lot of monitoring wells, but they only designate a subset of them as being representative monitoring wells in their basin to ensure, to basically monitor whether a certain sustainability indicator is causing undesirable results in the basin. And so one of the things that could be improved is increasing the number of representative monitoring wells and also prioritizing the placement of those in places where you have a wide range of beneficial users of groundwater. And in the study, we did do a post hoc analysis to see whether basins that had a larger number of stakeholders, whether the representative monitoring wells scaled with that. And we did not see that at all. And so that's a little bit disconcerting, because if you have more users that are throughout the basin and your representative monitoring wells aren't adequately reflecting groundwater conditions for those users, then you may not be able to detect whether or not an adverse impact will occur, let alone if you've even done that analysis when establishing your minimum threshold. So I think that's, in terms of that basin in particular, you'll have to reach out to them to see what their plans are.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, anybody else? Okay, moving on then. How will this information be used by DWR and other state agencies? And how can we make sure this research affects groundwater management?
As part of our kind of outreach for this research, we've been engaging closely with DWR and other state agencies. We shared preliminary results and we'll be meeting with them shortly to kind of show them our final paper. And we're hopeful that the recommendations that we've laid out are things that they are open to considering. I mean, we have noticed in a lot of their determinations of recent GSPs that they are flagging things like monitoring networks, interconnected surface water, groundwater dependent ecosystems, well mitigation plans. And so our hope is that our research and our kind of advocacy helps kind of keep them moving in that direction. I don't know if anyone else wants to add on to that.
We've also sent the reports on different email lists, and we also hope that this gets to local groundwater agencies, particularly the interactive tool is very helpful to see an overlay of all the wells within your basin and wells that are protected or not protected as GSAs plan to, increase their groundwater monitoring. And I would also add that we'll also share this with the State Water Resources Control Board. They've taken over some basins, 6 basins that are under probation. So we've shared it with them and also plan to meet with them to discuss our findings.
Okay, great. Moving on, Pablo, I see you have volunteered to answer this question, so I will ask you. How did you deal with domestic wells for which no data is available? I would think that the data you rely on in the study comprises only a fraction of all domestic wells. That is, a significant number of domestic wells is missing from your study, or is it not the case?
Yeah, I clicked on the wrong button, but I was trying to provide the well completion report data that we use for that study. So I'm just gonna copy and paste my answer in the chat for everyone because I put it in the wrong place. But that's basically where we got the data from.
And
Okay.
I can add to that. So we have a recommendation in our policy report about improvements to the well completion reports. That was mostly what we used in our study, but that's also mostly what some GSAs rely on to identify wells. And we found that some wells are abandoned, some wells are no longer in use, some wells have been dewatered, and so communities are no longer using that. So our recommendation there is for improvements to those well completion data. And I think DWR is currently working on that. If not, that recommendation is targeted at the states to improve the information of wells in that portal.
Okay,
And
great.
the other part of the answer from Melissa is that well records are required, but not all records are completed.
Okay, great. Thank you. Here is a question down at the bottom that has a lot of votes. How was the 1.5 mile radius for monitoring wells determined? The Kern County subbasin would need over 1,850 perfectly spaced monitoring wells for the basin to be considered covered.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it was definitely a technical and scientific consideration that we took seriously when we did the analysis. We actually conducted a sensitivity analysis using a range of 5 different buffers. So 0.5 miles, 1.0 miles, 1.5 miles, 2 miles, 2.5 miles. And really it's like, you have to balance the hydrologic realities of heterogeneity with the feasibility of like having enough wells and the finances and the logistical infrastructure to like even have that many wells. So that's why we did the analysis with a range to see how the results would change. And basically what we found, and in the SI of the paper, we have some figures that show the coverage of the basin and what percentage of wells in the basin are covered by those various size buffers. So you can see that in the paper. And then we also looked at how protection changed with those different buffers. And basically we found that protection did not scale so much with the size of the buffers. And in fact, disparity between the groups, so like agricultural users ended up being more protected than the environment and domestic users when you had those larger coverage. And essentially, basically a scenario where everybody would be covered if you had a larger buffer zone. So I highly suggest that you go, we have extensive SI, there's like 200 pages in the SI describing kind of like all the nitty gritty. There's not 200 pages on this topic specifically, but I invite you to look into the methods of the paper and the SI to learn a little bit more about that. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself, Deb, and Courtney, if you have questions about that analysis.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Can I make another comment on that, that question? So Melissa's provided the technical analysis language, but I think something else that we're interested in, if you go back to the image of the East San Joaquin, to the right-hand side of that basin, there were hotspots of domestic wells that there was no monitoring network. So when we're looking at that from a technical or analyzing point of view, we expect to see at least one or a few monitoring wells in the areas where there are hotspots of domestic wells. And on a separate study, we did something where we overlaid that information with DWR's dry well reporting tool and found that there are areas where so many wells are going dry, concentration of domestic wells, but there's no monitoring anywhere close to that region. So I think that's something else that this analysis study and tool can provide for GSAs.
Great, thank you. This question is kind of a long one. I'll try and do my best here. I assume that the maximum rooting depth was analyzed for adult full-grown trees. If so, how was survival and recruitment of saplings factored into the DO plans protect the environment analysis? And also impacts arising from stream flow depletion impacts to aquatic ecosystems is a critical environmental issue and should be considered. So saplings and stream flow depletion impacts, who would like to answer?
I can do that. So for the analysis, we used the California rooting depth database that TNC put together, which basically has a maximum rooting depth for each of the NC dataset vegetation species in the NC dataset that basically most agencies use for the identification of PDE statewide. And so the California plant rooting depth is based on literature review. It is kind of like the best case, best available information we have on thresholds at the statewide level. And our analysis looks at groundwater depletion, specifically chronic lowering of groundwater levels, because we were comparing across multiple groups. And the stream flow depletion in sustainability indicator does not directly apply to the other users, which is why we left it out of our study. But yes, I agree with you. Like it would be, if we were just looking at ecosystems, we should definitely look at do an analysis where we look at how stream flow depletion would be impacted. The issue is that to do that, we would have to establish statewide thresholds for all stream reaches in California, which Rick, I think we would have, basically struggle with at this point in time, because there has not been enough technical support provided statewide to establish these thresholds especially for stream reaches. And we can, go on a whole tangent on that. But so basically, recruitment so saplings and seedlings are going to need shallower groundwater levels than maybe the max rooting depth. And so basically, what we wanted to do in this study, it's the same thing with using total well depth. We want to provide a conservative estimate of protection. So those numbers that we provide, then the 9%. And the 40% for the wells, essentially, basically are best case scenarios. And so, if a lot of ecosystems have shallower thresholds than the maximum rooting depth. And so that's at the statewide level, that's the best that we could do with the best available science that's available right now.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, just less on the technical and more on kind of how we hope this information is used. Is to Melissa's point, this was done as a statewide study using the data that it was available to us in the first round of the GSPs. And what we were really hoping is that between the online tool and the methods that have been provided, that local stakeholders and GSAs can kind of use this information as a starting point for developing their own analysis of what is needed at, in their region, either for a monitoring network or for thinking about how to maintain groundwater levels across, temporal changes, drought years, flood years, things like that. But what we did was a statewide study and hoping that it creates some good baseline information for state agencies and local agencies to start taking action.
Okay, great. Anybody else? Okay, moving on. This is the follow-up question to the earlier question about comparative analysis. How about which GSP stood out as the best for each of the indices that were applied? Everybody's thinking.
I think so maybe Jeff can answer this. On the table where he shows the GSPs that have most wells protected and those that have least. I don't know if I'm going to say that's best. Maybe that's not a good answer to that question.
Yeah, I think it's kind of hard, but I think what people are asking for are maybe good examples of GSPs that dealt with at least most of these issues.
Well, I could show obviously the GSPs that scored better on this, but some of that is an accident of hydrography, and I don't know if we can intuit policy differences through this tool. But I'm happy to open up the tool and we could look at it together if anybody would find that useful.
I think just like the take-home message here is that no one did a great job, like across the board, right? And there's a lot of room for improvement. And that was part of the reason why we created this online visualization, so you can drill in to the various elements of what we evaluate to see who did well on what aspects. And so I think if you are curious about seeing like which basin did the best with mapping, with protecting groundwater dependent ecosystems or integrating agricultural stakeholders, you can do that with the tool. And we're gonna get different basins for each of those questions. So it's kind of hard to answer the question like who did the best, if that's the question.
And we should also point out that this is a new law, and everybody submitted a plan. Like nobody said, forget you, we're not going to do it. And so people really did make an attempt to comply, but a lot of work is needed, I think, is the message here. Okay, moving on to the next question. Can you elaborate on how the scoring worked for stakeholder integration? The supplementary materials say we evaluate stakeholder integration as described within the text of the sustainability plans. We focus on the phenomena of integration rather than stakeholder participation or collaboration. This seems incredibly subjective to me, and basins that had high stakeholder engagement and participation and incorporated that into sustainable management criteria can still get a low score if they didn't talk about it enough in the GSP.
So this is essentially what this is saying is that, so we were in participation in plans was one aspect of stakeholder integration, and that is captured by the engage score. And essentially what we, and you can see the scoring rubric I'll put a link in the chat to our scoring rubric where you can see the actual raw data from the scoring rubric. This is basically, asking questions on if there was active participation. A lot of plans, a lot of GSAs did a lot of passive forms of stakeholder engagement, like informing and consenting, inviting people for public comment letters, but there was very little active engagement in terms of inviting various stakeholders onto a advisory board or into a board seat to basically represent their stakeholder. And so in the scoring rubric, we have very specific questions within the engage component that captures whether or not they had someone on an advisory board or in a board seat. And then that's one aspect of it. And stakeholder integration is whether, it includes, if those stakeholder groups were described and identified in the plan mapped, and then if they were analyzed and integrated into the project management action. So a lot of stakeholder literature is about participation, but since we have SGMA provided us a great opportunity to evaluate the integration of these stakeholders in the plans, and then also outcomes from the sustainable management criteria to see if they're protected, that's what we focused on.
Okay, anybody else want to jump in? Okay, so we will move on here. Okay, next question is actually a multi-part question. Let's see. The summary report and page refer to monitoring and monitoring wells. What about groundwater pumping that is clearly too close to streams to not be impacting base flows? Then they asked, what about legacy impacts such as pumping too close to streams and historic wetlands that has long been ongoing? Another question about stream flow depletion.
Do you want to try, Pablo, and then can add on?
Yeah. So we refer to the monitoring wells, but only as located within a radius, no? But the wells that you saw in the tool, those are all the domestic and agricultural wells that are available. So that would cover question 1. And then the ground pumping initiating during the groundwater gold rush. Those wells are integrated there. The database that we are using is up to, I believe, July 2022. So those wells should be there. And any other, Melissa, of those?
Yeah, just to clarify, we do not look at there's no pumping data available for every well in the state. And so we're only looking at the total well depth of agricultural and domestic wells and how they compare relative to the minimum threshold and the monitoring wells that are being used to track whether or not a basin is being sustainable for one of the indicators. And as for groundwater pumping too close to streams, groundwater pumping really close to streams does impact base flow. So that's the answer for that. And then what was the other question? Oh, historical. So yeah, we're just using whatever data that the well data that was on Oscar. So if there was pumping, if there were wells installed post 2014 when the law was passed, we would have those in our database as well. Hopefully that clarifies or answers your questions.
Great. Anybody else? Okay, I'm gonna just ask a quick question here from Diane Johnson. That's Diane of the Desert. And she wants to know who she would contact to ask why Borrego Valley Subbasin was not studied because they are critically overdrafted. Do you want to answer or tell her who she should speak to?
So we evaluated high, medium, and critically overdrafted basins, and I thought we did evaluate Borrego.
Is Borrego part of a larger GSP? Because I've been looking for it in the DWR status page for groundwater for SGMA basins, and I'm not finding it.
I think they didn't adjudicate. Yeah, they didn't. Yeah. They started SGMA, but that they ended up with a adjudication.
Yeah.
Okay, so
we did submit public comment letters in 2020 for that basin. and evaluated it. Yeah, here we,
Yeah. It was a stipulated judgment.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was filed
Yeah.
right before the
Yeah.
deadline. Yeah.
thanks both.
Okay, I'm gonna go back up here to the next one. Based on what you've seen or heard, could each presenters, one for everybody here, state one strategy they think GSAs could or should implement to improve integration of stakeholder input when it is provided? What should they do? So let's go
I
down
can
the
start.
line.
My recommendation would be for GSA members to do a tour in their basin, to visit their disadvantaged communities and just trying to get familiar with the people that lives over their basin.
I can jump in. I think one of the things that should be prioritized when GSAs are thinking about next steps in projects is multi-benefit projects that benefit multiple stakeholder users, environment, drinking water, and agriculture. I think what we've seen, and one of the reasons why integration has been so low, is thinking about actions that really only focus on one of those groups. And so I think multi-benefit projects should be prioritized, and we've given that feedback to DWR, and I think it's something that GSA should focus on themselves and work with their consultants on.
Anybody else have a suggestion?
A recommendation I would have is to conduct an impact analysis. I think I've also seen this consistently in determination letters. Before a project or a management action is considered and implemented, an impact analysis of what that would mean on the beneficial users within the basin. I think if that's done, then GSAs will be able to identify that some projects might impact communities or disadvantaged communities, or it might impact the environment. So that analysis is necessary before decisions are made or voted upon.
Okay, I'm going to do something a little different here. Gus Tolley has put a number of questions in the Q&A, and he has his hand raised. So he has some questions to ask. I'm just going to allow him to talk. So Gus Tolley, you should be able to unmute and ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Excellent. Yeah, I guess I just have some concerns that the GSP process is very contentious, and there's a lot of pretty bold claims in this analysis. And it seems like maybe some of the data were a little blunt, to put it mildly. And so I'm just kind of curious if you think that you might be providing a tool for people to throw rocks at GSPs when this is an adaptive management plan. And there seems to be, like, for example, I'm not clear if you use the statewide well database that has the well locations located at the centroid of the section, why you decided to jitter the data and make it seem like you had more accurate well locations than you actually do. And there's a few other follow-up questions, like, for example, in Scott and Shasta valleys, your tool is indicating that 0% of the wells are protected, yet that plan, both those plans were approved by DWR. So that, to me, suggests there's either a flaw in your methodology or DWR is completely inept. I don't think it's the latter. So I was just wondering if you guys can respond to just some of those concerns that I have.
I can start on the broader concern, and then maybe Melissa can talk about some of the technical stuff. I think if you have some time to read the papers that go along with this data, you'll see that our intention for this work is to make Sigma succeed. We reviewed all these plans kind of with the lens of these vulnerable users, with the hope that in order for Sigma to be successful and follow the letter of the law, it has to be protective of these other users. And so what we're trying to do here is to highlight that so far that hasn't been the case, but our hope is that moving forward, that is what happens. So it was not our intent to do as you described, which is to throw rocks at Sigma. It's actually to highlight the places where improvement can be made so that it can be successful as it was originally intended to be. And that was our, as organizations that have worked really hard to get Sigma, passed and are now working really hard to get it implemented, that was our intent. And then I'll let Melissa answer. And as I've already said, we thought about this as a statewide study and as a starting place for local stakeholders and GSAs and folks working to use the data as a jumping off point. And not all the data that we used was the data that was provided to us in the plans themselves. And so we're basing all of this analysis off of what has been submitted to GWR. So Melissa, on the technical questions, I'll let you answer.
Yeah, and on public records, which brings me to the Oscar database. You're right. A lot of the actual GPS locations for domestic and agricultural wells are not provided, are not publicly available. When they were, we did use them in our analysis. And then for those that were not, they are associated with the centroid of the township section and range. And we use those. And that's basically within like a 1 mile area. So it's not, and we go into very much in detail in the SI section about like how we and in the data repository, how we clipped, buffers with the centroid and like if it was the whole box or not. So you need, if you have concerns about that, I really suggest that you read through the supplementary material and the data record. Like we documented everything very specifically.
No, I understand that, but your error in the well locations is on the same order of magnitude as what your radius is, and that is troubling to me. Because as somebody that works with the statewide data all the time, and that's one of my biggest pet peeves is, for example, with the governor's executive order for evaluating new wells, it's very difficult to do that analysis when most of your well data is only accurate to within half a mile.
Yeah, but we also did a sensitivity analysis, which I talked about before.
But
So
I don't understand how you run a sensitivity analysis when you don't have the accurate location data to begin with. It's
well, the town. Well, so this is a question. This is a question for DWR, just like state transparency. In general, like we're using the best available data, and we did do a sensitivity analysis using various buffer rings, and so. It wasn't always the same order of magnitude as the buffer ring, the township section and range. So we should talk about this offline because I don't want to go down into the weeds with the rest of the group, but happy to go into the nitty gritty with you and show you the data and how we did it. And, it was pretty rigorous. It got published in Nature Communications, which is not the easiest thing. So.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
we're getting close to the end of our time. Did you want to add something, Pablo? No?
I think that's just
Yeah, I just wanted to say really quickly that jittering in order to randomly scatter points within a acceptable threshold is a very common tactic in information visualization, so that you don't have information overplotted in a way that makes it impossible to tease apart multiple entities. And so I see what you're saying, Gus, and it's certainly not my domain of expertise, but that's a fairly common practice in geographical visualizations when you have that problem. Thanks.
And just to clarify, the jittering was happened after the analysis, just for visualization purposes.
Okay, well, we're at the end of our time, so I want to give a big thanks to our panelists for their questions. We still have a lot of questions, so please feel free to reach out individually to our panelists. And I have one more poll today, just to ask you what topics you would like to see future webinars and office hours on. If you can take a moment to answer that, that'd be great. And I want to thank all of you for attending, and a big thanks to our panelists. And there will be the recording and link shared in the chat will be sent to you, and I will I'll find out if the presentation slides are available, and if they are, you will receive a link in the follow-up email in the next day or two. So thank you all for attending. Have a nice rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.